All right, you ready for this? Today we're going deep on some true horror stories from the YouTube channel Mr. Nightmare. Um, you ready to get a little spooked with me?
Always ready for a good stare.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we're going to explore two stories and kind of talk about why these stories are so captivating, even if they leave you looking over your shoulder.
I think for me, it's always what draws me to this is that these stories tap into this primal fear we all have, that unease about what we just can't see or explain, lurking just beyond our comfort zone.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And that's what I really liked about the first story called The Lake House Nightmare, which definitely plays on that. Like, imagine, okay, you and all your friends, you rent this remote lake house in North Carolina for Memorial Day weekend, right? You're all excited. You're feeling very isolated from the everyday world. You're just ready to have fun.
I feel like that isolation is a key ingredient in a lot of horror movies, like horror stories, isn't it? Just setting the stage for these unsettling events to unfold, removed from all safety and civilization.
Right, exactly. So they're having a good time. They're enjoying the lake. They're enjoying the views. But then things start getting strange. They encounter this woman in the woods.
Oh.
And she's described as looking, a bit rough. She's yelling, she's angry, yelling about the noise they're making in the trash.
It's like that horror trope, Yeah. That unexpected encounter with a local who seems to know a little more than they're letting on. Like, what are they hiding? And she gives them a very cryptic warning about out-of-towners.
Right.
Before just disappearing back into the woods.
Yeah, so creepy. And that feeling of unease, it just keeps building, Later that night, they hear these cries for help coming from the lake. They're like, what is that? They rush to get into a kayak to go investigate, but the voice just fades into silence.
Oh no.
Back at the house, they hear blood-curdling screams.
Oh my gosh.
And it's the story just goes from so peaceful and fun to just sheer panic and a heartbeat. And that's what gets your adrenaline pumping.
Oh, absolutely. That sudden shift, you think you're safe and you're not.
Right. And then they rush back to the house and their friends have vanished. They're searching everywhere frantically. And that's when they see the woman from the woods watching them, but from the window of a nearby house.
It's almost as if she knew this was going to happen. It's
right.
How did she know?
Exactly. It's so chilling. And then one of the missing friends calls, frantic, saying, these men are approaching with axes.
What?
But the call cuts out. And when the police arrive, there's no sign of anyone, no evidence, no men, no axes, nothing. The missing friends eventually show up safe, but all those unanswered questions just linger.
Right. It leaves you with this deeply unsettling feeling, like something was terribly wrong, but you can't put your finger on what happened.
Yeah. And the narrator says that this whole experience made them avoid remote places for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So the fear, it really stuck with them.
All right, let's switch gears. Let's move on to the second story called The Boat, the Safe, and the Shadowy Figures. So this time it's Memorial Day weekend again.
But we're with a group of friends. We're enjoying a huge boat party.
This is interesting because it kind of blends these elements of realistic crime with this kind of lurking, undefined menace.
It does. It starts out like a typical party. Everyone's having fun. And then you realize their friend Jacob, who's driving the boat, he's way too drunk. And so now the friends are worried about getting in trouble. What if we get caught by the police?
Right, because that's the initial fear, right? It's just this fear of authority, which then sets the stage for a much darker threat, right? So it's almost like their anxieties are shifting towards something even more sinister.
Yeah, and that sinister threat appears in the form of another boat that seems to be following them. And at first, they're convinced it's the cops. But then as it gets closer, they realize it's not.
And this is where that unease kicks in, right? Because they see these three men on this boat just staring intently, almost aggressively. And it's a small detail, but it creates this huge sense of foreboding.
Yeah, you're right. It does. And get this. The men followed them all the way up the canal to Jacob's house. And they just watch from their boat as the friends continue to party, now by the pool. And the narrator, mentions feeling suspicious about the men's behavior, like they were scoping things out.
Oh yeah, that feeling of being watched, of being targeted, That's super unsettling. It really plays on that primal fear of vulnerability, the sense that we could be preyed upon.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what happens. Later that night, the narrator wakes up to a man in a ski mask holding a gun right in their face.
Oh, wow.
And that moment of realizing you are completely at someone else's mercy is just terrifying.
Yeah, it's such a stark contrast to that, carefree party atmosphere just hours earlier. And the story highlights how quickly things can change from fun to absolute terror.
Oh, absolutely. The intruders, they force everyone to take them to the safe where Jacob's dad kept all of his valuables. And they even make Jacob call his father to get the combination. And then they steal cash, jewelry, documents, like everything.
Oh, wow. It's like a classic home invasion, right? But what makes this one so chilling is that connection to the men on the boat.
Right.
It suggests it was premeditated, like they were deliberately targeted.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then the story kind of wraps up with the narrator reflecting on that feeling of being cased by the men on the boat. Like they were targeted because they saw Jacob's wealth.
It makes you think, right, like how much of what we fear is based on an actual real threat versus, what we just make up in our heads.
Right. That's a really good question to keep in mind as we unpack these stories even further. Because both of these stories, they have this strange blend of, feeling plausible, like this could totally happen, mixed with these almost supernatural elements.
Right. And often it's that lack of clear resolution, that lingering mystery that makes these true horror stories so effective. Like our minds are wired to seek patterns and make sense of things. So when we're left with these unanswered questions, it just creates a sense of unease that kind of sticks with us long after the story's over.
It's like it just keeps playing out in your head.
Totally.
We're left to fill in the blanks, which can be even scarier than any answer.
Absolutely. And that's where the power of suggestion, I think, becomes so potent. Like, take, for example, the narrator of the lake house story. They don't explicitly say that the woman in the woods was behind everything that happened.
Right.
But the way it's told, that juxtaposition of those two elements makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It just plants that seed of doubt, making us connect those dots, even if there's no hard evidence.
Yeah, like we almost become co-authors of the horror, adding our own fears and experiences into the narrative.
Right, so it's not just passively listening. We're like actively creating the horror in our own minds.
Exactly. And I think that's why these stories can feel so personal and visceral, because they tap into something really deep within us, resonating with our individual fears and experiences. It's almost like a mirror reflecting our own anxieties back to us.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about what makes these stories so chilling, but why are we so drawn to them in the first place? Why do we want to hear these stories that make us feel uneasy?
Well, that is a fascinating question. There are actually a few theories about why we find horror so appealing. One idea is that engaging with scary content in a controlled environment, like watching a movie or listening to a story, it allows us to confront our fears, but in a safe way.
Right, so it's almost like exposure therapy.
Exactly, yeah, we get that adrenaline rush, but without any real danger.
Right, and that can be like a cathartic release for a lot of people. Think about it's kind of like riding a roller coaster. You get that thrill, but without the risk.
Right, exactly.
And think about the friends in the lake house story. That shared experience, as terrifying as it was, probably brought them even closer, strengthened their bond. And this brings us to another theory, horror as a form of social bonding. Sharing these scary stories, talking about the things that scare us, creates this sense of connection with each other.
It does. It creates this shared experience that draws people closer.
Right.
And, it can also be a very safe way to process difficult emotions or anxieties that we might not feel comfortable discussing directly. It's almost like talking about fear without having to actually say, I'm afraid.
Right, I can see that. But also, there's that element of pure fascination with the unknown. Humans are so curious, aren't we? We are so drawn to things that challenge our understanding of the world.
Absolutely. And I think these stories tap into that kind of primal desire to explore the boundaries of what we know and what we don't know. They remind us that the world is very complex and often unpredictable and full of mysteries we may never fully understand.
Yeah, and that unpredictability is part of what makes life interesting, right?
It is.
That sense of mystery, the unknown.
It's about finding that balance, acknowledging the potential for danger while also staying curious about the world around us.
So before we wrap up our deep dive into these spooky stories, let's turn it over to you, the listener. What stood out to you the most? Which parts, gave you chills?
Yeah, was it that isolation of the lake house, the feeling of being watched by those men on the boat? Or was it that just lingering mystery, the lack of a clear answer that left you with way more questions than answers?
Think about what resonated with you the most and why. What do these stories say about our shared fears, our anxieties, and our fascination with the unknown?
It's so interesting how these stories, even though they're set in, these very specific places with these characters we don't know, they tap into these universal fears.
Right, yeah.
We all have.
The fear of the unknown, that feeling of being vulnerable, the anxiety of isolation. These are themes that resonate with everyone across all cultures and times.
Yeah, it's like they offer us a glimpse into like the darker aspects of human nature, the potential for harm, and our own primal instincts to survive.
It really makes you think. They force us to confront these, uncomfortable truths about ourselves and like the world.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Mr. Nightmare, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. How much of our fear is actually grounded in reality, and how much is fueled by our own imaginations? How can we separate, genuine danger from the stories we tell ourselves?
This is a huge question to consider as we navigate the complexities of life. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.